If you'd like, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Micah chapter 5. Micah chapter 5, that's where we're at tonight. So we've finished up chapter 4, which was pretty intense when it comes to looking at the prophecies of the kingdom, which I still feel, is very important. One of the things I want to kind of touch on as well is this concept called eschatology. And it's one of those words you probably, as most average Christians, don't ever really hear. But what that means is the end. Whenever the ending of time or the end of the kingdom or end of time, basically, eschatology, or the study of that time, of whether it's when Christ comes back for judgment and the different concepts and theories that people have around that, as you probably are aware, if not from last week, looking at the idea that there are different ideas on when the end is going to come and how it's going to come. And has it already came? And are we living in a different time in all the different concepts? So eschatology is the study of the end. And chapter 4, we looked at these prophecies. And I always liked the way Dr. North had kind of pointed out when he looked at the book of Revelation, that there's always what's being said right out front, very clear words, but there's also always a deep meaning. And so when we look at these prophecies, especially dealing in chapter 4, and we're going to deal with it in chapter 5 as well, so it does kind of flow. I haven't lost my marbles totally on this, but we're looking at the time of the prophets talking to people concerning a direct judgment that's coming upon them because of their sinfulness. And he's talking, Micah, to the northern kingdom. But there are some messages he has brought up that doesn't exclude Judah, the southern kingdom. And with that, he is talking about how they're going to be punished. He's talked about in the previous chapters the sins in which they've committed against them, the sins that they've committed among themselves, which is kind of interesting because if you sin against God, you probably have sinned against others. But he details them out. And then 3 was around the idea of the leadership and the sins that they had committed, and they were just really responsible for it, and how that they would lay awake at night, even kind of thinking up of different ways that they were going to kind of take advantage of people in different business schemes and such. And so then 4, looking at this kingdom that's coming, this release from exile, as they would hear this idea that, yes, you're going to go off into captivity, but God has always, always, always kept showing that his prophecies were going to be fulfilled and be completed in the arrival of the Messiah. And that Messiah, when he comes, he was going to bring with him a kingdom. That, I hope, if anything, if you disagree with a lot of stuff I say, and people who are watching me on YouTube, that is very clear. That is not really argued, even among those who have different concepts on the end times, but they do agree. The prophets are talking about that the Messiah, an anointed one, a son of God, and God himself in some way, but even the Hebrews understood that there was a divine anointed one, not just any created person, but they did believe in that. And what I just recently learned, though, was after the first century, because of Christians and Christians pointing to the man Jesus and saying he was the divine anointed one, that the Hebrews, the Jews, went back. Now, this is a century after Jesus. They went back and they called that teaching and those thoughts about in the Old Testament that they used to see, oh, that's a divine, that's a son of God, somebody divine that's coming, and they got rid of it, because it was actually kind of supporting the idea of what the Christians said, yeah, and his name was Jesus, and he was that divine one who became flesh. So, but as far as, like I said, all agree that all the prophets, Micah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Daniel, Isaiah, were all showing in their messages, the main one applying to the time directly, and one that was always pointing again very far to be fulfilled in this arrival of an anointed one, a Messiah. Remember Daniel? He gave him 70 weeks. In that 70 week, it was years. They knew when he was coming. So this is what we're tying into, and chapter 5 is going to help to bring this out. I talked about what they call a targum, where they're taking and using a couple of different scriptures, and they would restate them, and that's what we find. We're going to see that as we look tonight. So now, after he talked about this coming kingdom, there's an interesting kind of division that happened with this, the way that the Bible was divided. Remember, book, chapter, verses did not exist. Back, very, very recent history that somebody, I can't remember who it was, somebody in France was, a scholar went through and took the Bible and broke it into chapters and then verses and made sentences into verses and stuff. So it doesn't always get very divided appropriately at times. So that's what we see here is this first verse of chapter 5 talks about something that's really pertaining to the previous one. And I'll mention it now because I'm not going to cover it as we get into it and just read it to you. It talks about mustering your troops, O daughters of troops. Siege is laid against us. Thy rod shall strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. And that if you just take that one first verse of 5 and start reading the rest of it and try to join those together, that first verse is very disjointed because it belongs really in chapter 4. It should have been the last verse of chapter 4. It's nothing to discredit the Bible. It's just the way that whoever divided this, that thought really should have been tied, because that's dealing with Zion and it's dealing with the kingdom that's coming. And what's beautiful about it, and why I want to kind of touch on it, is look at the way it talks about they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. That is a direct reference to the high priest when Jesus was standing in front of him. And that's why Caiaphas lost his mind when he beseeched Jesus to confess who he was. And when Jesus said that he was the Son of Man and you would see me coming in clouds, Caiaphas knew he was claiming to be the divine anointed Son of God, the Messiah who was going to come. And then what did he do? They struck him on the cheek and strikes him. And he was their king. And here he was, they were striking him. Not only that, but if you recall, even the rest of the story of his interrogation and stuff, that one time the guards themselves took Jesus and they mocked him. Remember, they dressed him up in a purple robe. They put the crown of thorns and smashed it into his head, and they spit at him and they ridiculed him. Scholars point to this and say very, very clearly, this is a reference to the idea of how they were going to treat the one that comes with that kingdom. So I should have probably grabbed that verse last week and brought it in. So in summary, kind of when we look at this as the kingdom's coming, there were 4 things that Micah is saying has to happen. And he's telling them. This is one of those things that's directly telling them. They know this kingdom's coming. So to them, they would say, oh, we're going off into captivity and we're going to come back and get a kingdom. Yeah, you're going to come back and you're going to be reestablished and you're going to have a kingdom. It's always going to be manipulated and dominated by somebody else, but that's not really what I'm talking about. God's like, there's something better. So they would see, one, they got to come out of captivity. Now, this directly supports with Isaiah. Now, remember, Isaiah is a contemporary. So Isaiah is preaching and prophesying at the same time that Micah is. So they understand we have to go to captivity. Now, Daniel also had prophesied, and he had talked about it, this idea of this timeline. So they're all supporting each other. And then in verse 10 of 4, he talks about this delivery from there, and that it was going to be by God. It wasn't going to be something natural that they were going to be able to break away, but it was going to be something and purposeful that God was going to bring them out of this. And this idea of many nations gathering up against the Jews, that also has kind of the idea that if you think about when they came back and they started rebuilding, what happened? They met a lot of resistance. They had a lot of the people who were living there, the Samaritans, tried to come in and rebuild and help them. They said no. They said, we don't want your help. And then the resistance that they tried to stop them from building the walls and stuff. But it also is something greater. It does talk about and showed that lower message of how that the nations would rage against Jesus and rage against this kingdom that he was going to bring in as well. And then that verse 1, I just talked about the idea of their ruler in this return and this kingdom coming would be humiliated. And he was not only humiliated, but the part of that humiliation was the brutal execution at the hands of the Romans. So now we come on into verse 2, and he's going to talk about precisely where he's going to be born. And that's something that it almost, well, we probably hear this a lot more around Christmas time or different times. But look at, he says, but you, O Bethlehem. Out of nowhere, all of a sudden, he goes, Bethlehem. Ephrathah is another word for Bethlehem. He's using dual names because it was a little obscure, the location of Bethlehem. Bethlehem was and really still is a no-name place. It never grew into a big city, but it had great significance when it came to traversing and traveling. And so he says, but you, Bethlehem, you who are little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old and from ancient days. Now, when you look at this, you go, okay, wow. Now we know the kingdom is coming, and now we know we're going to get this ruler. He's going to be humiliated. Don't quite understand that. They didn't understand that, but okay, we got that. Now he says he's going to be born in Bethlehem. That's where he's going to be born. And even though you're the smallest, now what's fascinating and beautiful about Bethlehem is it's a house of bread. Bethel, and Beth being bread, El, God. But when he includes this other term he's applying, Ephrathah, that is fruitful. So it's kind of a beautiful way of saying a fruitful, something that's going to be productive and fulfilling of bread. Now, Jesus said what? I am the bread of life. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Guess who else was born in Bethlehem and was a king? It was David. Bethlehem, even though it never became a very significant city, in matter of fact, today, if you were to Google Earth, you would look, you could see that Jerusalem is almost at the borders of where Bethlehem exists today. And it's still just a little small city, but it's always been there. It's always kind of been there. It reminds me of how that God has always said, I'm going to take things that people don't think are very wise or very important, and I'm going to make them great. Watch me. Because logic would be, bring the anointed one and have him born in Zion, in Jerusalem, right? Have him born where he's going to rule. That's the way that nobility usually is. You have your king's children born in the place that they rule from. Okay, well, pick another one. Go to Hebron. Hebron's even a better place. That's a real significant. Bethlehem. You remember whenever the wise men came, and they were searching out this one to be born, which, by the way, those wise men that were traveling were probably traveling from Persia with knowledge that they probably gained from, guess who? Daniel. Because Daniel ended up becoming the lead in a wise man when it came to prophecies and other things. So most people believe the exposure of that teachings from Daniel, being there for so long, had taught them. And that's why when they saw the star, they were like, that's what we had been hearing for hundreds of years from that wise man Daniel. So they were searching out. They knew that this king was coming. And so what do? They come to Herod and they go, where's this at? And then Herod secretly goes and he asks the scribes, he goes, where is this? And if you'll recall, they say Bethlehem. And they quote Micah to Herod. They say exactly what it says there. O Bethlehem, you who among small will come this ruler. So that's how they knew. And that's why, like the Gospel of Matthew is using stories and says this was to confirm, to try to show the Jews all these little prophecies that they could not quite connect and how they had been concealed. And then in the gospel, he points them out. And so here, Bethlehem, another aspect to this, when he says, coming forth is from old, from ancient days. If you're looking at that superficially, you could think, well, he's got an old genealogy. I mean, what does that mean? From old, ancient days, historical, something very long ago. And so you could say and apply it by saying, well, Bethlehem, oh, David. David was born in ancient of days, long time ago. And kind of go, well, that is fascinating. That kind of links to it and could possibly be that he's linking to the reign, which David was promised by God that the scepter would never leave him, and through him, through David, would come this anointed one. But in the Hebrew, and if you were to go back and understand the way that this is being put together by Micah in Hebrew, it's deeper than that. This has tremendous significance in helping, and the Hebrews understood this as well, that this is not just saying an old genealogy, but referring to more of eternalness, a part of divinity, Elohim, a part that was with the Father, the Godhead. The Hebrews understood that there was two parts to the Father and God, but they couldn't quite name them. And, only now we can look back and go, oh, there's a Father, there's a Son, and there's a Holy Spirit. And they're a unique Elohim. And there we call Yahweh. When we say Yahweh, we're referring to an Elohim that's very unique. And so within that, they understood and could see two. They saw it with Moses. They saw it in different writings from Moses. They could look at and read it. And so when they saw this and heard this, they were seeing something that was eternal, always, the I am, from the beginning to the end, the Alpha, the Omega. So that's another thing that's unique. He's going to be born in Bethlehem, and it's going to be basically God in the flesh. Now, you and I, when we read this, we go, wow, Ron, where'd you get that? And that's, again, because we're looking at thousands of years removed from a Hebrew culture that none of us have studied. And the other thing is coming through then the English, trying to appropriately make it in a way we can understand it. But that's the power of, when we look and we study these minor prophets, how rich that they can be here. So then if we go on, then he says in verse 3, therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. This again is kind of cryptic. It's also, again, if you're listening to it originally, you would hear something very positive about coming back and being restored until after this long captivity that was going to happen to them, and then the rest of the brothers, they would all be reunited. But this is another deeper one that's pointing out this idea of the Messiah and coming and gathering. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock. Now that sounds a little more familiar, doesn't it? Like this idea of this leader they're looking for, in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. Now this overlaps with Isaiah and what Daniel's talking about, that this kingdom that was going to come was going to expand and continue to grow, and it would become invincible. And so they would be secure, because like I've said, you cannot destroy the kingdom of Christ. You can't do it. And you say, well, what type of security? Because I know they killed thousands of Christians. Well, that's the issue. You could kill, whenever you had the kingdom of David and kingdom of Solomon, you could kill 1 million of them, and that kingdom would collapse, and it would go away. You could annihilate it. You cannot annihilate this one. You may kill Christians all day long, like the Romans did and others, but the kingdom will never collapse. It will continue to grow in supporting the other. And he shall be their peace. And this is the part of the peace of being with God and being reconciled back. Remember, the Hebrews understood that sin was just being atoned by sacrificial, continual sacrifice. And he then links this term really kind of being the Prince of Peace, this Messiah, the one he's talking about here, as well as the prophets in other locations. Then the Assyrians will come and pour into our land and treads in our palaces. Then we will rise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men, and they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. And he shall deliver us from the Assyrian, and when he comes into our land and treads within our border. Very cryptic again, but the idea of Assyria and these nations that have rose up, this battle that would happen, and without going further, we'll look on. But now, this remnant, there's always been a message of there's always some that are left that are righteous. Always. Very, one of the main themes. And so in 7, he says, then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like the dew of the Lord, like the shower of the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts in the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of the sheep, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces, and there is none to deliver. You see this mixture? When he talks about this remnant, it's among the nations that there are. And now, a lot of times when we look at this nations, we think of physical boundaries, but this is really also an inference towards nationalities or races, that it's the remnant is a part of many more, and that it will have this powerful presence that's going to be throughout the whole area. And so that's the beauty and the power and invincibility of this kingdom that will be coming. And then he says, your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. And in that day, now remember, I've always said, in that day is linking to a specific time period once it's been fulfilled. In those days, it's a period dispensation. So we're again looking in the day when this kingdom arrives, this is what's going to happen. And in that day, declares the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you. I will destroy your chariots, and I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down all your strongholds. And I will cut off sorceries from your hand. You shall have no more tellers of the fortunes, and I will cut off your craved images and your pillars from among you, and you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands, and I will root out your Asherah images from among you and destroy your cities. Remember, there's an application direct talking about the judgment that's coming and how the Assyrians will come in. But there's also, again, this idea and showing that when they come back out of this captivity, they're not going to have a problem with fortune tellers and sorcerers and stuff. And that is something that was fulfilled. When they came back and they rebuilt, from that time after Babylon, never again did the Jews have any idol worship problems. Very amazing. And that's exactly a fulfillment of this prophecy right here. And referencing also the rebellious people and nations, he says, and in anger and wrath, I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. They're not alone. The ending of last chapter, he also inferred this idea of those nations in which he was using to come and bring this judgment, they were also going to have a judgment. Just because God uses a nation that is ungodly to carry out justice doesn't mean that they can escape the wrath and judgment on themselves. And we see that happening with the Babylonians. We see it happen with the Assyrians as well. So that is chapter 5. Next week we'll get to 6, and we're getting close to the end of this little book. So if you're here with us this evening and there's something that we can do to help you in your relationship with Christ, I hope that you would take this moment while we sing this invitation song and let us help you in any way we can. So shall we stand and sing?